Hello there. I'm Josh Kazin, and I'm presenting my research, Stuck in the Middle, the impact of price closeness on context effects and reward-based crowdfunding menus. This is a co-authorship with Daniel Zantadeshi at the University of South Florida. So I'm going to disappear my webcam so I don't block any content. And now we'll get started. So it was motivation. First of all, reward-based crowdfunding is a digital platform, and we know consumers are very unlikely to shop optimally in such platforms. They'll exhibit patterns of behavior like binge shopping, fraud. They'll ignore shipping costs, and they'll attend to irrelevant stimuli. And this last point is where we're going to focus on in this paper. So firms, they may design menus using what are called decoy options that act as positive comparisons to increase profits, and this is very prevalent. Specifically, it's much more prevalent in digital markets than in retail settings. So this inefficient choice due to the decoy options is going to allow lesser products to dominate markets. And in more ways, crowdfunding in particular, where entrepreneurs are launching market innovations through consumer pre-purchase, this is going to hinder innovation and raise inequality as reward-based crowdfunding loses efficacy compared to traditional investing. And specifically, it's going to hinder innovation because consumers are the ones that are supposed to be determining what do they want in a market. If they're not making the best possible choice, they're not choosing the best possible option, then it's going to be less efficient than it would otherwise be. Now, in terms of equity, in traditional investments, there's a heavy male bias in that only 2.7% of venture capitalists and 10% of angel investors are women. And this impacts the investments markets in that only $1 out of every 23, excuse me a minute, $1 in every 23 is given to female entrepreneurs and small business lendings as investors tend to invest in products they're aware of, they know about, products they would buy. Anyone that's watched Shark Tank, I guess, could tell you that as well. So this leads to huge inequality in traditional investing. Now, reward-based crowdfunding, it goes ahead and it corrects this bias to a large extent because 45% of reward-based crowdfunding backers are women, and these are auxiliary of investors. They're slightly different. We'll talk about the differences later on as we go and investigate the platform and describe it. Now, 1/3 of creators in reward-based crowdfunding are women, and they're actually more likely to succeed than their male counterparts. So there's a lot more equity in this platform than there is in traditional investment. And when consumers on the platform are making an efficient choice, the market is not sustainable in the long run because it's not selecting the best possible products for the market, the best possible innovations. Then you will start to see this channel erode so that inequality becomes more prevalent as traditional investing begins to dominate again. Now, hopefully, it doesn't happen, but we're going to say that this could cause this issue to motivate our point to try and sell our research. And on top of this, understanding consumer choice in general is incredibly vital to consumer protection. And we'll have policy recommendations at the very end in our conclusion here. So a preview of what this paper does is that our main results, we show that consumers prefer menu options with closer price neighbors. So we're going to take a sample menu, and this isn't going to be the structure of all the menus that we examine, but we're just going to simplify the structure and say there's a small option, a medium option, which is our focal option, so what we're focusing on, and a large option. And the large option's price is far apart from the small and the medium. In sample menu 2, if we bring down the price of that large option, it's going to increase its own buyers. It's going to increase its own demand. But interestingly, it's going to increase the demand for the medium option. This is what we're showing. So this is converse to what you would expect in that if I bring down the price of the large, more people are going to upgrade away from the medium, and it should reduce the demand here. But we see the exact opposite. And the reason for that is that consumers have some range of consideration. So they're looking within some realm of prices for what they're thinking about buying. And when the large is this high price, it's outside of that range of consideration. So it doesn't act as any sort of comparison until you reduce its price and bring it within that range. So now it establishes a favorable comparison that makes consumers feel more confident purchasing the medium. And this is in line with the literature, an effect called context effects bias that we'll talk about the theory on the next slide. So the way we see this result is that the cross-price elasticity is negative for upper price neighbors, for high price neighbors, and positive for low price neighbors. So the closer you bring these prices together in this way, the more demand you increase for the focal option, for the medium option. Now these elasticities are going to be driven by neighboring inferior options, those that have zero demand. So when we're bringing these references closest, we're establishing contrast, we're establishing context rather, but we're not actually taking away demand because we're bringing something that's inferior that consumers don't really want, but it's going to bring to light the positive features of our focal option. On top of this, we introduce a novel identification strategy and we support it with both model-free evidence and a robust series of regression analyses. And our methods, as well as our results, enable deeper tests and establish deeper tests of existing theory models, which there are two prominent theories for this behavior. The first has to do with the salience of comparison being improved as you bring options closer together. And the second has to do with the idea of consumers are exhibiting range-based thinking. They're considering the range of available options when they're making a choice. And we do define context effects bias on the next slide, so apologies for that. It's slightly out of order. So we show that this increase in demand due to the closeness of price neighbors, which is due to the context effects bias, again, comes up on the next slide. It comes at the expense of the outside option. So for the most salient menus, if they're well designed and priced, if they're closely priced, then other menus that are within the same category that people will see second to these featured campaigns that we'll talk about, the ones that are most prominent for consumers, they're going to suffer. They're going to have lower demand and revenue overall for the ones that are in the same category in the same month. Now here's a table of context that we're going to go into. Next, we're going to dive into the literature, and I'll define context effects bias here, and then talk about the empirical literature as well as our contribution to both the empirical and theoretical literature. Then we're going to go ahead and describe the platform itself, Kickstarter, talk about the menu characteristics and our data, and then present our main results and empirical strategy, and eventually conclude. So context effects is going to show that if a new menu option is introduced, it's going to increase preference for existing options due to positive comparisons. So a traditional picture of consumer choice is they're going to choose whatever's maximizing their utility. So that's going to be this option Y when Y and X are available. And our theories, our axioms of real preferences say that always consumers should prefer Y over X if any new goods introduced. Maybe they don't always buy Y, but they definitely don't buy X before they would buy Y. However, what context effects has shown, which was introduced by Huber et al. In 1982 and extended significantly by Simonson in 1989, is that if we introduce this new option Z to the choice set, where Z is very clearly inferior to X, so it's going to bring to light that X is both better in attribute 1 and attribute 2 than Z, but Y isn't very obviously superior to it, it's going to make consumers prefer X now because they feel more confidence that, hey, this thing's at least better than one good, one other alternative in this menu set, so I want to buy that. So that's the old literature, and since then, theories evolved significantly. The most popular theory is Bordello et al.'s salience theory, which says that if a new menu option is introduced, it's going to increase the salience of positive features of existing options. So for X, it's going to say, oh, hey, it looks like it's better in both attribute 1 and 2, and people are going to pay attention to that. Now, the actual salience theory is a little bit more complex. It's basically saying there's a 45-degree line here, which is the average quality per dollar, average quality per price ratio. And if you have an option that's higher in price, that's below this line, the price is most salient when you're considering that option because it's falling below this average quality per price. Think of it in the supermarket, you get like ounces per dollar spent or cost per ounce. You're going to typically buy the thing that provides the best ratio here of quality per dollar spent. So that's going to be this low option here. So that's what they choose in this case. But when a decoy option is introduced, when this option Z is introduced to the choice set, it's going to extend this average. And now, as this option falls above the 45-degree line, consumers will start to pay attention to its quality because it's saying, okay, relative to the average quality given per dollar spent, I'm doing better in both this option L and this option H. So I'm just going to pick whatever one has the highest quality, and they'll end up opting for this high quality option. So that's salience theory. And the most recent contribution to the theoretical literature and context effects is distinguishing based on range-based thinking. So the consumers are considering the entire range of options available. And this is where our paper fits well. So consumers are considering this range of options. In the set one, you have, sorry, in the set A, you have option one and you have option two. And when there's just two options, consumers attend to the full price difference. They're looking at that full perceived cost to upgrade from one to two. But if we go down and we introduce this option three that's at the high end here at $40, then it's going to extend the range. So the relative difference in price between options one and two, it appears smaller to consumers, and they're less turned off by the increased price of option two relative to one. So they're more likely to make that purchase. And we just zoom in on this theory a little bit more. You're going to have both a price and a quality scale. So the option three that's introduced has a higher relative price than its relative quality. It's going to dilute this range of price more than it'll dilute the range of quality. And so that the perceived benefit to upgrading, which is the quality gain, is going to be relatively more than the perceived cost in the second scheme where option three has been introduced. So for option A, when you don't have this option three skewing the range of choice, the benefit and cost, they equal out to the exact scale that you get. But because you're introducing this option three that has like slightly worse quality relative to its price, it's making the perceived benefit appear larger than the perceived cost, which shrinks in context of this now $40 option. So consumers are more likely to buy option two in the second scheme as the perceived benefits increase relative to its cost. That's just a brief overview of the theory. Now, context effects in the empirical literature have only been cited in a handful of papers. And most of these are going to rely on introducing an inferior option to menus, establishing what's called the decoy effect. So in lab experiments, this is how context effects started. And they've since evolved to do more. But for natural experiments, we're still at this realm. We've never done anything beyond a decoy effect experiment in natural settings to establish context effects. And they've had settings where you've struggled to reproduce context effects, where it's been very tenuous to reproduce it. So the efficacy of these are dwindling. So we need more settings in which they do apply. And the real restriction here is that it's very hard to identify context effects because you're dealing with menus. You're dealing with introducing a new option to a menu, which is very often endogenous. It's very rare that introducing a new menu option, new choice, is an exogenous thing. So we're going to have a nice contribution here, which I'll get to in the next slide. But before we get there, we're going to talk about how does behavioral and attention interact with context effects. Well, it's going to diminish it because to have this contrast of a comparison affect choice as people are attending to these attributes of products, you need to pay attention to it. You can't be inattentive. So two papers which are in lab settings, Liao et al. And Chung et al., show that closer comparisons in price have stronger context effects in the lab. And this is quite hard for them to do. One of these is a neuroscience paper. So they're literally doing this through brain scans. They're looking at brain scans as consumers interact with certain choice sets. And so that's quite a tough method to do. They have a very small sample size as a result. This other paper, it's a little bit more classical. It's just showing that additional comparisons are going to weaken the efficacy of each, and this is for reference pricing rather than outright context effects. But there's very few papers that have explored other attributes beyond decoy effects. And they've had to do so through some pretty extreme methods. On top of this, in crowdfunding, we're going to make a contribution to a growing set of literature where context effects have been explored, but they've always been explored in mock lab settings within crowdfunding campaigns. So mock lab or mock crowdfunding campaigns they've been using here, with the exception of Wyman et al. That they've done for a sample size of literally one live crowdfunding project. They've put in a context effect, or sorry, they put in a decoy option. So they kind of fit up within this literature here. So we're going to contribute to this and that we're going to do this in a natural setting. And then within crowdfunding, there's been a small set of exploration of the impact of campaigns on one another. So the impact of campaigns on others, where highly successful campaigns will crowd out the market, but also highly manipulative campaigns will have this crowding out effect. So we're going to add one other impact of campaigns on one another, which is on the next slide. So we'll get to the crowdfunding impact in a second, the crowdfunding contribution. But first, we talk about the context effects contribution. Well, we've designed a method and we validated our method that enables the study of context effects without needing a decoy option. That's going to extend the scope of practical settings and enable more experimentation within context effects. On top of this, we're examining in a natural setting one dimension that just has not been studied, which is the price closeness. So how does the price closeness impact the efficacy of context effects of comparisons across tiers? And so we're going to have a much larger sample size in the lab setting experiments that have done this. And it's going to support the range-based theory model of Bouchon et al. That's where we primarily make our contribution. As we show that range of consideration, the price itself is more important than or at least equally as important as the existence of a decoy. And finally, we identify the impact of context effects on the outside option. We show that the source of the excess demand is from these concurrent campaigns, from these outside options that act as alternatives to selecting from our focal menus. Now, to crowdfunding itself, we're going to introduce a large-scale study of the impact of menu design on success. There's been only very few experiments that have done this so far. And we expand the literature with an additional experiment that shows the impact of campaigns on one another. In this case, how is the menu designed? How will that affect other campaigns? So this is our primary contribution to the two strands of literature. And we're going to focus on behavioral impact. We'll talk about the crowdfunding in the conclusion, but we're mostly going to focus on the behavioral impact going forward. Before we get there, though, we're going to describe the setting in which we do our experiments and which our natural experiment takes place, and that's Kickstarter. So in the platform, it's going to allow creators to launch market innovations through pre-purchase capital, so buyers pre-purchasing products, and also donations. And when a campaign succeeds, it has to deliver the rewards that were purchased from its menu. And Kickstarter takes a 5% cut of this revenue raised, not the profit, but the revenue. There's terms and conditions. The products, they have to be new to the market. It has to be an innovation. It can't be something that already exists. And donations cannot be towards investment in the company at all. They have to be purely philanthropic. And there is this known focal point for donations, which is towards meeting campaign goals. And that's an important mechanism in our paper. And we do show that our context effects are specifically due to consumer behavior and not this donor aspect of the markets. I do have that relegated to a backup. So I'll talk about it at the end after I've concluded. I'll give some pause and say this is the end of the formal talk. And now this extension, because the main focus is the primary results, not ruling out this donation channel. All right, so typical campaigns, they're set up, well, all campaigns, they're set up in this standardized format where the creator sets a goal for raised capital. And if they meet that goal, they deliver on the rewards. They have to deliver on the rewards or refund consumers. But if they don't meet that goal, everyone's refunded their money. So there's no loss if you invest in a campaign and it doesn't succeed. Now, products are usually still in development. Innovations are not already created. They're using the funds from the crowdfunding campaign to create the product in some way. And because a product, sorry, a campaign, a project is focused as bringing one new innovation to life, it's not going to be offering a set of options on menus. It's usually going to be offering different versions of the same good. So in this case, it's wooden sculptures. Everything on the menu is some form of a wooden sculpture. So it's different variants of the same exact product that will appear on menus. So they're not going to be wildly different things. It's not like we're comparing apples to oranges here. We're comparing apples to maybe slightly more expensive apples, as we'll get into. Now, the menu itself, it is our focus, and these are strictly ordered by price. So they always go from low to high. It's very nice for experimentation. Sold out options in the menu, which can be sold out due to some limitation, so some expiry, or a capacity limit on the number of backers within that tier, which is what we call a menu option, up here at the very end of the menu. And consumers, they can only purchase one option from the menu itself. So each option here is called a tier, and they have a defined price, a message, description, or a title, and then some number of backers. And this is a full menu, a full set of 7 here that we've shown as a sample set. So again, each menu option is called a tier, and consumers have the choice to buy exactly one option from this menu. These first few options, they're not offering the actual product they're trying to bring to life. They're offering thanks, which pure thanks, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. It's called a donation tier. And then something irrelevant, which we can also define as kind of a donation tier. $20 isn't really too much. Um, it's not a good deal for a t-shirt, basically. $20 plus shipping, not a great deal. Where this is the actual product it's trying to sell. So it comes a little bit later. And these first few tiers that aren't actually selling the product will act as a good comparison to the product itself because they're not taking a lot of demand away, but they're establishing some price points. So, oh, for only $5 more, I upgrade and I get the real thing that I'm interested in. It's going to increase demand here. Okay. Now, coming on to this, we have different types of tiers. So the most common, menus will commonly use what are called donation tiers. So just providing thanks without any substantial product, and deluxe tiers, where deluxe tiers they offer, and they're usually labeled as deluxe or like super deluxe. They offer some significant, or sorry, some slight improvement on the product for a significantly higher price. And this is because production it's usually outsourced, and when you outsource large contracts, you get a lot of economies of scale. There's a benefit to reproducing on mass scale small things, the focal good, the base good. But when you have a limited set of like exclusive products like the Super Deluxe only has 12 backers, that's going to get a lot more expensive per unit than the focal good here, a base good, I mean to say. So this is going to give the price variation primarily in the menu is that economies of scale. So these deluxe versions are usually not a good deal. And then finally, how do consumers search? How do they search for different campaigns? Well, if you come on to Kickstarter.com, you're going to be met with a splash page, a home page. And on this home page, it's going to have featured products here. They're going to be featured due to some undisclosed algorithms. We don't know necessarily how they get here. But if you click onto a specific category like design and tech, that's going to come up with this sort of splash page specific to that category. And we do know how these recommended products come about. This one's due to a staff recommendation, so staff gets to choose. These are always going to be the products with the highest percentage funding. So we know exactly what product campaigns come up as the most prominent, or the first ones consumers see. And consumers very often search by category. It's the most common way to look for something to support because people are usually interested in something specific like arts, comics, design tech, rather than something general. So relative to these focal or these very salient prominent options, concurrent campaigns within the same category are going to act as our outside option because people are either buying from these first 3 or they're scrolling down a little bit to look at, and we couldn't see it here, but this would be the list. Let's scroll down at other concurrent campaigns within that category. So now we're coming to our data, our menu characteristics. And we started with a full list of all projects that were launched in the US from 2013 to 2020. So we started with 130,000 campaigns in total. And we're taking from each menu option rather, the price, the description, and the demand. So we're taking that from every single menu option. Once we have all that, we're going to remove any campaign that has a default currency that's in something other than US dollars. We're going to remove campaigns that use a tier that's too expensive, so it has a price of 10,000 or above, and then also these tiers that are free, which was a limited time promotion on Kickstarter. Then we're going to merge menu options tiers that have the same exact price and differ solely due to cosmetic features like color, style, and the like. This is almost exclusively the only reason they have the same price, these products. So we're just going to combine those into one single tier at that price point. Next, what we do is we match each tier with text, title, and description. If we can't find them, they have to be omitted from the sample. Because this next stage is very important, where we're going to combine tiers with the same title and description into the lowest price tier. We're going to merge together those that are selling the same product but at different price points because of these certain sale mechanisms to Kickstarter. So that's on this next slide. We merge sales. So we have this thing called an early bird sale on Kickstarter. It's very common. And this is going to say for a limited time only or for a limited number of backers, I'm going to give you a discount on whatever our base product is. And that's going to draw a lot of attention to it. Now, for whatever reason, it's quite common for these early bird sales to be present throughout the entirety of a campaign. So they won't always go away at the end of the campaign. So these will sometimes still exist, the sale version of a good, or a consumer will choose to lower the price of a product and offer a discounted version at some point within the campaign itself if they're not selling enough. So what we do is we eliminate these words that are associated with sales, and then we match tiers based on their text description being the same, at least 95% match after we've removed these keywords. If they have this match, then we're going to say they're offering the same product, and we're just going to collapse these into the lowest possible option that's available at the end of the campaign. To say this is the only thing that anyone should really consider is the lowest possible price point offering the same product. So we're going to get rid of this old tier that had this too high of a price, and we're going to collapse it into this lowest price option that should be the only one consumers consider, and we're going to adjust our price gaps. So we're going to say, okay, now this 25 one essentially doesn't exist to our menu. We're only comparing the 20 and the $30 option here. So this is to eliminate the effect of framing something as being on sale, as essentially differentiate context effects from reference pricing. Okay, once we've gone through and done that, we're going to get rid of campaigns that have either too few tiers, so less than or 3 or less, or too many tiers for analysis, so more than 100. And finally, we'll drop tiers that are no longer available at the end of the campaign, either due, again, to this expiry or due to the capacity being reached. So we'll get rid of those at the end of our scraping process. Okay. So we come into our summary statistics here, where again, menus are strictly ordered by price, so we can easily calculate the price gaps, which is the difference in price between the focal tier and its upper or lower neighbor. In the summary statistics, we report the difference to the upper neighbor. And we calculate the percentage price gap, which is the price gap above, divided by the price of the focal tier. So now we just look at the summary statistics here. Your average tier has 20 backers, a price of just under $300, a price gap, a gap to the next tier of about $170, a percentage price gap of about 180%, and 1% is a sale. So 1% of tiers are framed as a sale. Now campaigns as a whole, get 180 buyers on average, raise revenue of 1100 or 11,500, succeed about 50% of the time, and have an average number of tiers of 8 or 7% used sales. We'll talk about these close descriptions on the next slide. So to describe menus, at least with model free evidence, we want to come up with some description to split them into what is sparse and what is closely priced. And we're doing this based on the top seller of each menu. So we say a menu is close if the upper price gap is less than 100% and a lower price gap is less than 50%. This is going to split our sample almost exactly in half, but it's also going to be very important thresholds because we'll show later on these are the vital regions to increase demand. So as we split our menus into these close and sparse menus, we're going to look at the order of appearance on menus and see what is the percentage price gap, just to get an idea of the menu structure across these. We're going to start looking at the third menu option because 1 and 2, they're typically donation tiers. They cost like $1 to $5 on average, so they have kind of skewed percentage price gaps. So looking from 3 onward, we see that close menus have much closer upper price neighbors. Makes sense, they're close menus, but also that this range is increasing for the first few menu options, which is kind of interesting. Whereas sparse menus, it's decreasing throughout. They're getting progressively closer and closer together. Whereas here, they're going to have a few kind of close comparisons in the third to fifth options, and then they'll start extending the range. And then things get pretty noisy because our average number of tiers are 8. We don't have much data beyond that. Now here the same thing, we're going to order the x-axis by order of appearance on menus, and we're going to look at the demand here, the log of tier backers for close menus and sparse menus. For close menus, they're going to have more demand further, like deeper into their menu, and for sparse menus, they're going to fall out, and they're going to rely mostly on their first few menu options to reach most of their sales. So they're not going to contain consumer attention as much as closer menus. Now we have a very important definition here that inferior tiers, we distinguish them as having 0 backers. They're the ones where no one buys them. This is 22% of all the tiers in our final analysis sample. So looking by now popularity order on the x-axis, if you have log tier backers, you're going to have a lot of demand in these first few options, and then demand's going to fall off pretty quickly because this is a log scale. This is like, and it's a natural log scale. So this is like 3. It's this line at 1. This is 10. So after the 8th or so option, you're starting to see, on average, you have 1 backer in these menus. So you have quite a few inferior menus or tiers beyond this point. But for the case of model-free evidence, a menu's top-selling tier is going to be superior to its neighbors. So we're going to put here the distance from the most popular tier, where this is the most popular tier at 0, and then this is upper price neighbor. This is lower price neighbor. And again, we're distinguishing between close and sparse menus. So for the most popular tier, having close surrounding options, having close surrounding tiers is going to increase its demand quite substantially through the positive comparisons, because this thing's going to be superior to everything around it. It's the best selling tier. And we see that quite clearly. It has a large spike in demand relative to its neighbors for both close and sparse menus. But for close menus, it's significantly greater demand than for sparse because of the closeness of comparison surrounding it, which will drive up its demand. And then kind of interestingly, the one point at which the close menus demand is less than the sparse menus is for this upper price neighbor, which is specifically going to be smaller in price than the sparse menu. It's the only thing that we actually restrain to be smaller in price than the sparse menu, because we're saying the gap between this 0th option and this first option is less than 100% the price for close menus, but making no such restraint for sparse menus. So this is a low price thing relative to the red, but it sells less because it's acting as such a strong comparison for this most popular option. So it's driving away demand here, and it's actually having a very strong effect on sales because this is, again, a log scale. So differences up here mean a lot more than differences down here. Okay. Now we're going to come to our empirical strategy. So we just presented some nice model-free evidence of the impact of closest comparison. It doesn't let us examine to the extent that we want to examine, and it can be due to substantial differences between these menus, the ones that are close and the ones that are sparse. So to further explore this, we're going to regress our log demand on our neighbor's price. This is our key regression to see what is the impact of our price neighbor's price on our own demand. But we're lacking a measure of quality, and that's going to generate some biases in our sample, in our estimates. So to address this, we're going to use a partial identification strategy. We're going to derive the neoclassical biases in our coefficients of neighbor prices and see, do our results match those biases or are they opposing? And so the way we'll get identification is if they oppose those biases. And we're going to later validate this method by adding in some quality measure, that inferiority definition I gave before. But before we get there, our demand, our log demand Q, capital Q, is going to be some function of the quality of your focal tier, little q, and the price of that focal tier, as well as the quality and price of its neighbors, tier t minus 1 and tier t plus 1. And we're going to say this is the linear projection on these values, but we don't have quality, so the quality is going to enter into this epsilon into our error term here. And what we're going to be left with is our core price elasticity. This should be present. And then our neoclassical biases here due to the absence of quality. So our prediction, our prediction for these is, of course, we have negative own price elasticity, but that neoclassically we should expect to have positive cross price elasticity for the upper price neighbor. And this is going to be the composite of two terms. First of all Kickstarter menu options are going to be substitutes, and that's going to generate a positive bias because the cross price elasticity for substitutes should be positive for upper and lower price neighbors. But also, if menus are second degree price discriminated, designed by this to cause consumers to self select and to profit maximizing options for the firms, it's going to generate a positive bias only in the upper price option. And we formally prove this in the paper itself. But the logic is that as a firm isolates a menu option, they're trying to drive up its demand. So if you increase the price of the upper price neighbor and decrease the price of the lower price neighbor, you should be anticipating a higher demand for this focal option. So for the neoclassical prediction, the biases for the upper price neighbor go in the same direction. They're both positive. But for lambda 1, they're not. It's ambiguous overall because this second degree price discrimination is going to have a negative term here and a positive here from it being substitutes to the focal good. So we can't identify the direction of this bias. Now we're going to use these biases to determine what is going to be the effect of these comparisons due to the context effects bias. How is that separated from the fact that the menus are trying to be designed to cause consumers to self-select? And the fact that these menu options are all substitutes entirely. So we're going to try and identify this as our key term, this delta 2, which is the context effect of the upper price neighbor. And this is going to be negative because what we're expecting for these context effects, the closer they are in comparison, the more powerful the context established. So the more they should influence positively the demand for our focal option. So if the lower price neighbor is brought closer, if this is it's going to increase demand, or if this is brought closer in terms of it's being reduced in its price, it's going to increase demand here. And because our expected effect, if there are context effects, is opposite of our biasy in our neoclassical sense, then if the composite term of our regression, which we're just regressing directly the log demand on price, lower price, upper price, so the price of the upper neighbor, price of the lower neighbor, and these other terms we'll talk about in a second, then if the composite term is overall negative, we'll have identified, at least partially, that there are context effects driving it for the upper price neighbor, but we can't point identify them. And then we have these other components of our regression. So we're controlling for if a menu option is designed or determined to be on sale, which we would expect should increase demand, and also the order in which it appears in menus. As you go further into the menu, people should pay less attention to it because they should focus more on what they see first. And we're using a fixed effects specification here. So sorry, a mixed effect specification here. So the fixed effect component is going to control for project quality, and the random effects component is going to control for differences in menu design. So differences in quality amongst tiers as firms use different menus to capture consumer attention in different ways. Okay, and now our results. So the key term here is again the upper price cross price elasticity. Is we see that is negative. So this means that that delta 2 that we were talking about before, it dominates. It drives the cross price elasticity be negative for the upper price neighbor. So that the closer it gets, the better comparison it is, increasing demand. So this is going to be evidence that focal options with closer neighbors have increased demand, and specifically this evidence is the context effect, in that consumers are going to be more likely to buy the focal option if they know it's at least better than one close comparison. So what's going on here is at the bottom, again, the consumer has a set of considered options. And as this upper price neighbor is brought down in value, in dollar value, it enters into this considered option and then establishes a favorable comparison to the focal tier, driving up its demand, but does not interact with it until that point. Okay. So that's our main results. But we want to defend our method. We want to defend those main results. So we're going to introduce this empirical strategy through the guise of inferiority. So we're going to use those inferior tiers we mentioned, those that have zero backers, as quality controls, so we can limit these biases due to excluded content or quality. And we're going to be able to identify, or so we're going to be able to point identify the impact of price closeness for inferior tiers. We can identify their relative cross price elasticity to normal tiers, but we can't outright identify their cross price elasticity. Just technicality of a regression model. The argument for why we can identify this is that the price for these inferior tiers should be exogenous because they have zero demand. So it's not entering into a rational consumer's choice. That's not using it as a reference because no one's considering buying these things. It should be strictly inferior to everything else on the menu. And they're also exogenous in terms of their price and quality relative to the firm, who does not intend them to be inferior unless they have advanced knowledge of context effects that we, to this point, as academics, haven't established. So it's very unlikely for this to be the case. So they should be exogenous to the firm that just never intends to sell zero with a menu option. So we're going to use these inferior tiers for both upper and lower price neighbors, but we're also going to have an additional measure for lower price neighbors, and that we can use donation tiers as an additional measure of inferiority. They're not going to have zero backers, but they're going to be irrelevant to buyers that are interested in purchasing the main product that's advertised. We're going to talk mostly with just these inferior tiers. So we're going to amend our empirical specification, adding in these inferiority measures. So an indicator for, is the lower priced option inferior? Is the upper price option inferior? And then, very importantly, we're going to add in the interaction of that inferiority with the price of the lower price neighbor, the upper price neighbor. And in doing so, we're going to separate the comparison with inferior neighbors from the comparisons with normal neighbors, so that we should be isolating the context effects for lower and upper price neighbors, in that we isolate those deltas we had before. So they're separated from the neoclassical bias. Now, in terms of the pure cross price elasticity, these are still going to be composite terms. They're still going to have, to some extent, the context effects playing a role, but they should be predominantly driven by neoclassical comparisons with superior options that consumers do consider. And everything else on The regression specification is the same. So looking at the results of this in sections 3, 4, 5, and 6, we're adding in these inferior sets. And we see that, okay, it's as we expect. This is positive for an inferior lower tier. So the closer it gets, the better comparison it is, driving up demand for the focal option. And it's negative for the upper priced tier that is inferior. And so these values in red are going to be the cross price elasticities of inferior options relative to normal options. So we could take the addition, the sum of these two values to get the overall cross price elasticity for inferior options. But remember, this is going to be biased in some way. So this is not going to be a true value. So anyways, these interaction terms between inferiority and the cross price, sorry, the log of the lower price and the upper price are going to be identifying directly that inferior comparisons, which draw strictly positive comparisons to the focal tier, increase demand. They're demand enhancing. So otherwise, they shouldn't play a role because they're inferior options. No one considering them. They're irrelevant to choice. But they are through the power of context effects, through the establishment of context for the choice of focal tiers that are something people will consider purchasing, driving up demand. And then in specifications 5 and 6, we're adding in donation tiers as an additional establishment of inferiority is basically a no buy option for donors that are purely interested in donating. But something that acts purely as a reference points in price for buyers that are interested in buying the actual product itself. And once we add that in, we're going to get the negative value that we expect neoclassically for the lower price, cross price elasticity. Excuse me. So these are our main results. They validate context effects. They show that we have this inferiority playing a role in establishing demand for the focal tier. The more inferior, sorry, not more or less inferior, but if you have an inferior comparison, it's going to drive up demand quite a bit. Even though it's containing none of the demand itself, consumers are not paying attention to these tiers. They are paying attention to the comparison of these tiers with others. Okay. So the next step here is to look at the regions of the impact on demand. So we're looking at our coefficient and a regression, and we're replacing the regressions that we had before, where you had log of price neighbors with just the price gap. So the percentage price gap for upper and lower neighbors. And the idea here is that the salience of comparison, it's going to be enhanced whenever a neighbor is closer. But for upper price neighbors, when you bring it closer in comparison, this means reducing the price, and that's going to make it less inferior. So there should be a sweet spot for upper neighbors where you've maximized your comparison with the focal tier, and going any lower in price is now going to take away demand from that focal tier because people will start buying this upper price neighbor. And for lower options, this doesn't exist. You shouldn't see any focal spot because bringing it closer to the focal tier means increasing its price, which is going to make it more inferior. So for this graph, the price graph is shrinking to the left for the upper percentage range and to the right for the lower percentage range. And so we see for the lower percentage range, it's going to have a smaller and smaller. Oh, sorry, I got these backwards. Hold on. Sorry about that. The price graph shrinks to the left for both cases. So as the price graph shrinks for the lower neighbor, you're always increasing demand for the focal option because you're making this more inferior as well as a better comparison. But for your upper price neighbors, at some point you hit a sweet spot where now I've made it a good comparison at this range of 75 to 100% higher price than my focal option. And now, once I start decreasing price beyond this point, this is becoming less inferior. It's actually going to start siphoning away demand from my focal option. And it's not going to have too much of an effect on demand beyond this. It's just going to jump almost immediately from this point. Okay. So we see this nice trade-off between salience and inferiority here, as well as we see some good regions of when do you have an impact on demand. And this gives credence to the idea that at some point it's going to enter into the consideration, the considered options of consumers. And once you've gone to this point, there's no real benefit from further decreasing the price because it doesn't become a better comparison here as soon as it enters that considered set of options for most consumers. You're just taking away your own demand because you're making it now look, your focal option look worse in comparison as you're driving down the price of this um, comparison option. All right, so finally we come to the impact on the outside option, which is going to look at the impact of campaigns that are closely priced on other concurrent campaigns. So the idea is the excess demand, it has to come from somewhere, and we see that it comes from consumers' preference for menus that are closely priced over their outside option. So we see that featured campaigns are going to crowd out others within the same category within the same month when they're effectively priced, when the percentage price gap is very small. So when we're decreasing the percentage price gap for a menu, we're increasing its measure of success on all three counts. So the demand here for one, the revenue for two, and its chance of success for three. Don't know why I didn't click there. But when the top three menus, the ones that are most prominent, the ones that are featured under each category page for each month, when those increase their price gap, sorry, decrease their price gap, they become closer priced together. So this is negative. It's going to decrease demand for menu options, sorry, for menus outside of that top three. Here. But interestingly, you have a higher chance of success for menus outside of the top three because the donors that are interested in meeting the goal don't have to go and support those top three campaigns. They can actually go out and they can support campaigns beyond the top three because their funds aren't needed. They've already met their percentage funding goal. And I forgot to mention, but this is a completely different regression scheme. We're just regressing each one of these dependent variables on these for campaign level regressions. So the percentage price gap, the price gap of top three menus, the number of campaigns in the same category in the same month. And then we're using this average revenue of the top three menus as our measure of demand for the given month. We can also do this with a fixed effect for each month as a whole, or just each month of the year, like January, February, whatever, or January 2013, etc. We've done both, and you have the same pattern of results. This is just a stronger measure of demand. It's more direct, and so I include it here. On top of this, we're going to use dummy variables for each category. So with that result, we're going to come to our conclusion. Our primary results was that we found that consumers prefer goods with close price neighbors, and it evidences the context effects and extends the scope of knowledge, which is around to develop theory. And we also show that this preference for close price neighbors, the preference for focal goods when they have closer price neighbors is driven by inferior options specifically. There is some sweet spot in terms of you should have an ideal price range of 75 to 100% for upper neighbors. And the excess demand created by establishing, so this is to enable it to enter into this set of considered options. And once you go beyond that, there's no benefit, there's no added benefit. And we find that the excess demand from context effects comes at the expense of the outside option of other menus that consumers will go and buy on. That's just a refresher of the results we presented on most recently. But these results, they're not going to be unique to reward-based crowdfunding. They should apply to all digital settings. So they shouldn't be due to this donor interaction. I'll talk about that after I wrap up the conclusion for those that are interested. But within reward-based crowdfunding specifically, these context effects are going to impose inefficient choice, and that's going to damage the efficacy of the platform. It's not going to let the best products go to market. It's going to let products that are kind of cleverly priced with clever menus succeed. So our recommendation is that the platform establishes some ex-ante comparisons to establish context for all menus within each category. You could do this within each month based on the best selling options from last month, or you could do this just with static comparisons of past successes. And this will limit reliance on within menu comparisons that do elicit the context effects that we demonstrate here, and overall equalize the playing field so you don't have to rely on manipulative menu design to succeed in the platform, or at least there's no extent to which you have to rely on this technique. Now to end, I mentioned that we are extending this work pretty significantly. We have two planned projects set up. This first is we're going to explore dimensions of closeness other than price. So text description is our primary another measure we're going to use. And we're also looking at how did platform policy changes impact all the learning of sellers in terms of design menu optimally, but also the relationship of consumers and context effects. So there's some prominent policy changes across our data. The biggest one being that they added titles at the top of each tier. That's a very prominent bold text display for indicating if something's on sale or just calling attention to the text of a tier rather than its actual price. So this is the work stuck in the middle. It explores context effects in crowdfunding, and we improve the literature in a few key ways. Sorry, I'm trying to fit it into exactly under an hour. It's quite a chunky paper. So I've gone over, I've skipped over a few details. But if you're interested in the paper, if you want to read it, just send me an email. I'll have it available to you. And for those of you that are interested, I'm just going to go quickly over in the backup slides and talk about how we're able to say that these are primarily due to consumer behaviors, not donor behaviors. So this is in our appendix of the paper. We look at the reproduction of our main results, but only for different ranges of goal attainment. So most of the donor behavior is going to be limited to this range of 100% funding to 130% because they're pushing the project, the campaign, just over this threshold of meeting their goal. So this is where we expect most of the donor behavior. So if we look beyond that, where campaigns are clearing this threshold quite a bit, there should just be pure consumers here. And if we look, we have our inferior upper tier relationship being exactly what we expected, and our inferior lower tier relationship being exactly as we expected, as well as these values here are still showing context effects in non-inferior tiers even. So it's quite large. Um, there's other nice features of this result in that the price elasticity is higher for these options as donors are just not likely to support higher price tiers. They're more likely to shy away from it and just support a donation tier and donate to the campaign. And then also at the extreme here, 0 to 70%, those that are nowhere near meeting their goal, they shouldn't have any donor activity. And we also see context effects pretty prominent here. We see them throughout, right? The context effects are shown throughout. This term here, in terms of context effects in the normal menu options, is only really shown for this 130 plus range and the 0 to 70% range also to 100% where you don't have donor activity. But these are where it's much more prominent. And within this range where donors are playing a strong role and pushing it over, we actually see that the upper price elasticity reverses itself. It's positive here. So there's not a large set of context effects, meaning people that are buying in this setup are not likely to be skewed by these other factors because they're not interested in having the product itself. They're interested in the product success. All right, well, that's the paper. Thank you so much for listening, and take care.